Welcome back to the Physician's Guide to Doctoring. On this week's episode, we have a guest host. So please be the same respectful audience you are for me and enjoy. Doctors like us have demanding schedules. So growing our portfolios shouldn't be another burden. And the last thing we want when we take off our scrubs is a call from a tenant about an overflowing toilet. So Equity Multiple brings us streamlined access to vetted real estate investments that work for us, even when we're off the clock. And only 5% make the cut. Once we invest, a team of professionals goes to work to maximize our returns. With a minimum investment of just $5,000, diversify outside the stock market with cash flowing CRE like multifamily, industrial self-storage, and more. Welcome to modern real estate investing. Visit equitymultiple.com to learn more. That's equitymultiple.com.
Nearly 1 in 3 physicians in the U.S. have been sued for medical malpractice at some point in their career, and yet we rarely talk about it, especially in the context of our early career years. Listen in to today's important conversations as we dive deep into this topic.
Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is your host, Dr. Amna Shabir, and today we have Dr. Saba Fatima with us, and we will be talking about a very important topic. Dr. Saba Fatima is a pediatric hospitalist and assistant professor at KU School of Medicine, Wichita. She's a passionate advocate for physician wellness and addressing secondary trauma in healthcare workers. She is certified in narrative medicine from Columbia University. She hosts the Muted in Medicine podcast, where she sheds light on often silenced topics in healthcare. As a writer, she contributes to various academic journals and blogs, spreading awareness on physician wellness issues that are often left unspoken. Welcome to the show, Dr. Fatima. How are you doing today?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Likewise. So I first was drawn to a LinkedIn post that you had made about malpractice litigation, a paper you had written that had been published in, I believe, the Hospital Pediatrics Journal. And that really struck a chord with me as I help younger physicians that are in the early career years, and the fear of litigation is very real. And as I end up helping older physicians and mid-career physicians, I feel like that also, it doesn't go away and it's very relevant. So I would love to know what drew you to that in specific in writing that paper.
Yeah, without going into too much of the nitty-gritty details, I would say it was inspired by personal events. Obviously, I had my own experience through litigation, which is why I wrote that article, but more so frustration with the system, because I feel like a lot of times when this happens to any physician or even nurses or pharmacists, it happens to a lot of people. This is the first time that is happening to them. Because it's very common, but it doesn't happen like every day or simultaneously or every month. And it almost feels like the first time you get sued, somebody's going to say, hey, don't talk to anyone about it. And so you've been told about this really bad news that you're sued and you're not supposed to talk to anyone about it. You don't know what's going to happen. And so you're in this weird space of isolation and shame and fear and apprehension and anxiety. I can use all the words for that. And I guess you're supposed to figure it out yourself because nobody's really talking about it. So the purpose of writing this article was mostly, I think, to create more awareness, especially in academic spaces, because I work in academics and I feel like when I go to academic conferences, nobody really talks about it. They're all talking about, hey, how can you choose wisely? How can you practice less defensive medicine? Sure, I'm going to do it, but can you talk about the reasons why I might be practicing defensive medicine? Yeah, and I'm grateful that they agreed to publish that paper too, because they were also on board to spread awareness about it.
That's huge. I love what you just said, that we talk about the Choose Wisely campaign and practicing good medicine, which is appropriate, but really tapping into, we forget that we are beings that are complete. We have all our centers are working at the same time. I love the concept of interconnectedness. So the feelings of anxiety, the feelings of real fear, you talked about shame, apprehension, and silencing. So I see that the platform that you have created to raise awareness is also called Muted in Medicine.
Yeah. And you work with early career physicians, right? I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate that every topic that I've talked about in my podcast up to now, I have gone through it. And so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but When I started, so I've been 6 years into practice now, and I felt like after residency, and I felt every single thing that I went through, like shame, grief, I've gone through it. I had an unexpected loss of a patient when I was postpartum, like 6 months or so. And I was depressed for 6 to 7 months after that, and I didn't know what to do. So I was searching my phone to find something that would help me in that time. A friend who would say something that was more personal, not something that I got off the internet. And so I finally found something on a podcast. And then I came across the concept of self forgiveness, and I finally felt better. So I think that's the reason why I created the podcast, because if someone is struggling through something in silence, maybe they can listen to it and not feel that alone. Because, in those first 5 to 6 years, also, when you're working out of residencies, when you're most naive and you don't know, and then you come across these things and really you're clueless. So that's why I started Muted in Medicine, just because I felt like these things need a voice, because you don't talk to your colleagues about it. I mean, I don't know if you do, but I don't. Like, I never talked to any colleague about my lawsuit. I couldn't talk about a lot of the shame that I was feeling about losing my patient. So just to create more voices around these topics.
That's wonderful, because you're right. It's psychologically unsafe to share. And you already are suffering massively from imposterism at that time.
Right.
You are supposed to have it all together. You can't just walk around telling people, right? That's what we project. And we then wonder why we're burning out, why all of these things, why moral injury is seeping to the core. Meanwhile, I love Marian Edelman's quote that says, "You can't be what you can't see." And you are modeling this silencing. If that's what you're modeling, that's what you're going to get. And I'm so glad that you're opening up and you're talking about an experience that's so deeply personal to you, but also so relevant. We don't talk about it. And we absolutely don't talk about it in academics. We talk about all the other good things or more heavily curricular things, but we're not talking about this very real fact of life that we're all a statistic in it. So I would love to hear if you wanted to share some numbers surrounding, I read your article, you had mentioned the numbers from 2022. Like, how much at risk are we? Like, what are the numbers saying in terms of litigation?
So it's pretty common, more common than we think. So 1 in 3 physicians face a lawsuit across their career, which is if 3 of us are having a dinner, 1 of us might have been sued or will get sued in the future. Obviously, we talked about the anxiety, depression. There have been papers that published, especially in surgeons, where it said that it increased the risk of suicide by 61% in one of the studies that they had done. Obviously, OBGYN and surgery, these specialties are more prone to litigation as well, and hospital-based specialties too. So I only primarily work in the hospital. And even though it's not as common in pediatrics, it is common in hospital-based specialties. But yeah, it's very common. It's also 7% of physicians will have a lawsuit over 1 year across various specialties. So if you talk about just 1 year. So yeah, it's very common. And I think there's more conversation around it, but not as much as we would like.
What do you think as we look at those numbers? They are staggering, and you are in academics. You are doing your part. What would you say to the other physicians that are listening to this conversation right now? Because we all are in our own circles. So for example, if somebody is in academics, what would you tell them?
If they're just about the numbers or if they're fearful of getting sued, is that what you're asking?
Yes. So I would say, like, talking a bit towards both parts of it, the fear of litigation, or if they are going through that, what to do at that time. Let's start there.
So it can happen because of various systemic factors. But if you are practicing good medicine, and even if you end up getting sued, you can always defend yourself. So that's, I think, extremely important. The third thing it always comes down to is like good communication with the people around you. Find somebody who you can talk to. If there is something that happened at work, like a peer or a family member or support person who you can talk to, find it ahead of time before you get sued. And then also, I think just don't make it a big fear that runs over your life. I think it might happen, but if you're practicing good medicine, if you have a support system, you will be mostly fine. And I'm going to say for somebody who does get sued, I'm sorry. First of all, it sucks that it happened to you. It's a big deal. I'm really sorry that it happened to you, but don't take it personally. I think a lot of times we lose our sense of identity. It feels very personal. If you're getting sued, I did something wrong. There's so much shame and guilt around that time. But it's just the risk of working in this business. I work in a very high risk profession. It's not really a personal failure, I think. Like you talked about, it's an imperfect system. Errors happen. So don't take it personally. The second advice that I am going to give, don't take it personally. And then lean on facts, not emotions. When you look into the medical case, if you put your emotions into it, then it will be harder for you to defend yourself when you go into that case. So look at the facts, look at the medical facts, and then take care of yourself. That's all I'm going to say. It's hard that it happens, but don't make it a big deal over your life. So assign a small piece of your brain to that and don't go over through it every day, and it will get better, I think.
So what I heard was educating yourself where you are at, the state, the laws that are present, and having a plan almost, if it happens, what to do. But the most important thing I want to focus on in what you said is not internalizing absolutely everything to be as a personal failure of self. So breaking this down a little bit more and recognizing that you are a human. Because when you become a doctor, the flawlessness has to be there. The perfection has to be there. We are not allowed to be human. And yet we talk about human error, medical error, like all the disclaimers that we sign wherever we go, but just like recognizing that by trade, I love that you mentioned that recognizing that this is a high risk profession. Number one. Number two, not only is this a high risk profession, we also work in a broken system. So you hear your burnout, your moral injury. This is what contributes to moral injury. The fact that you have to go through this. That day when that event happened for which you are being held responsible for, what was the support that you had? How much sleep did you had before? Like, how were you? And then whatever happened. I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I also want to draw attention. You mentioned communication, however. Dr. Fatima, one thing I get asked a lot is, or worry, charting. A lot of my clients will not close their charts because they keep reading and rereading the decision making. Did I miss something? Did I not miss something? To the point that some folks are behind a lot of charts. So even with AI and scribes and people coming in to help you, at the end of the day, you're the one who has to close the chart. And the failure to close the chart because of this fear of litigation, I would love your thoughts surrounding that.
I think the biggest piece is you can't live with fear. You have to trust your education, right? You went through so and so years of medical school. You went through so and so years of residency or fellowship. And now you're doing this job. This is something my husband always tells you have to trust your education, that you're here for a reason. And at that time, when you were there with the patient, you made the best decision based on whatever you had around you. And that's exactly what you're going to put in the document. And that's it. You can't live your life based on fear. I totally connect with that. But I think you just have to trust yourself and your education. And if it happens, like I said, it's not, the entire onus is not up to you. Just remember that. I thought about my daughter. She's 4 years old, right? If she broke something really precious in the house and maybe it was in a wrong spot, or the floor was slippery, or maybe she wasn't being careful enough that she broke this precious thing, I'm going to put her in a corner for every single day for the next 3 or 4 years, and I'm going to shame her for that. Why did you do this? That you broke this thing? Can you imagine what is going to be the effect on her brain and anxiety and depression? Like, that is the effect of litigation on doctors. And this is not to say that patients are at the center of our work that we do. So they do deserve justice. This is not to say that patients don't deserve, but I do think the process and the system with which it happened is fair. To just blame one person again and again and have them go through this and relive that nightmare. So it's a terrible system.
I have never heard that analogy before, but it sounds so well positioned. And of course, we're all on the same team in that sense. We all want the best for our patients. Like, it's been on the other side of the exam table. It's not fun when you are in the seat of the patient. But ever since time has gone by, I have just developed increased compassion whenever I've had healthcare challenges, because I see my colleagues who care for me or my family members, and I know this person probably hasn't slept. This person probably is covering for everything that we can think of. But you're right. And justice is it's an important and it's a heavy term, but that shame is so real. So what should people do in academics? We're not talking about this a whole lot. And as you're shaping young minds, what can academic clinicians do differently?
I like to talk about it, and I think that's the best you can do. It's people who just to be one, because everybody makes mistakes, right? It has almost happened to everybody. If you haven't been sued, like you have made a mistake, you have had a bad patient outcome or a bad experience, something, or you have felt shame. So just talking about it more, I try to, and then normalizing that errors do happen. I see the expression on some of my trainees' faces if they make a mistake, it's deer out of headlights. They can't believe it, that they did it. That how did they make a mistake? And even though we should be very careful and we should try our best to not make mistakes, it does happen. So just trying to normalize that for them. just the humanity of us all and just creating more conversation. I think we should have more grand rounds about it. We're not having any. We should talk about it in conferences. I'm all for it. We should talk about it in academic journals because nobody really talks about it. So just creating more conversation. And it helps when people higher in hierarchy do it because they have been through more. And it helps their junior learners more when people do that.
You're modeling that behavior of not being muted in medicine yourself, like quite literally, pun intended there, but recognizing that we definitely hold our oath sacred. All the values that we carry and embody, the integrity, all of that is there, but also recognizing we can do anything we want to, but we cannot stop being human. And yet we are constantly expected to not be human at every level. And I think that is what is much needed with these conversations as well, returning that and modeling that. And absolutely, when older physicians, when more seasoned physicians that have gone, like you look, I'm a geriatrician. I love talking to my patients because I love listening to the experiences. I feel like I soak in wisdom. When we share these things with our early career clinicians, they are definitely going to be getting the value of those things. And as we explore this a little bit further, for those specific feelings, what you mentioned about grand rounds, sometimes I feel that when they pick a case, and sometimes depending on the academic setting, it can also then start into this toxic, I'm going to point this out, this happened, and I'm going to make an example out of you. And there's like this line between these two. You don't want to be in that space either. Your thoughts on that?
Like that, are you talking about that blame game if they start blaming each other? Yeah, that's not how hospitals should work. That's not how academic systems should work. And they talk about, I think there's more awareness like about having a just culture and having, whenever a mistake happens, looking into the systemic factors. Because I'm going to say it again, you can't blame the individual. Like totally does not make sense to blame the individual when something like that happens. And where I'm fortunate to work in a setting where there's not so much blame game, but I think just going towards that just culture where you look at where the system is, and that's same in academics as well.
As we wrap up for today and we start thinking and reflecting on creating more safer spaces for our trainees, for our physicians, for our colleagues, what are your take-home points to anyone who's listening, either fearful or going through this or has gone through this?
The first thing that I also say is if you've gone through it or you've made a mistake or you're exposed to litigation, just forgive yourself. Because I feel like a lot of times we start blaming ourselves and we go into that spiral and we can't get past it because we want to change the outcome. We want to change the outcome so badly for this family. Why were we sued? And we can't change it, so much so that we think that everything is in our control. It's not. So realizing that everything is not in your control, there's a lot of gray area in medicine, realizing that you entered the hospital not to harm the patient and you never wanted to intentionally do that. And then forgive yourself and accept it. And that's the only way you'll be able to move past whatever trauma that they've been through and do something better for your patient next time. Just learn from it and take care of yourself, I would say. And you're not alone. That's one thing. A lot of physicians get sued. A lot of physicians make mistakes. Yeah.
You're not alone. And a lot of self-forgiveness is needed. And just recognizing, I love that you said, nobody walks into the hospital wanting to harm a patient. We all go there with that common goal of practicing the best medicine that we were trained to practice. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you. This is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice or financial advice or really any advice. Thanks again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.